Tonight, I'm sharing a legend disguised as a love story. One so wild and true, it feels like the mountains themselves whispered it to me. It's breathtaking. It's brutal. It's the kind of romance that makes you believe in impossible things again. Deep in the high mesas of Arizona, where crimson cliffs stand guard over hidden canyons, and the sun paints everything in fire and shadow. This is the raw edge of the frontier, where enemies become everything, where one glance across a battlefield of dust can rewrite destiny forever. It begins with an act so brave and so foolish, it should have been forgotten. A healer running headlong into a roaring storm to save one bleeding man, and unknowingly saving herself in the process. Before we step into their world, hit like if you're ready for the ride, and let me know down in the comments, where are you gathered around the fire tonight? This yarn starts back in 1871, out in the Arizona Territory. A mean, sun-blasted stretch of red dirt under a sky so hard and blue, it looked like it could break you just by staring. Smack in the middle of all that nothing stood a little trading post called Solitude, and inside its shadow lived a woman named Vesper Quill. She was 32. Back east in them fancy cities, 32 might have been prime time. But out here on the ragged edge of nowhere, where the sun carves deep lines across your face before you're even 20, folks figured Vespera's best years had already rode off without her. She was a widow. 5 years earlier, she'd laid her husband in the ground. A man she'd respected, sure, but never really known. He'd been short on words, and even shorter on kindness. When he passed, all he left behind was a one-room cabin, a shelf of old doctor books, and a quiet so thick it settled over everything like red dust. Vespera was the town healer. She was the one folks fetched when a young'un was burnin' up with fever or a ranch hand got stove up by a horse's hoof. Necessary? You bet. Respected? In their way. But seen? Never. To the good people of Solitude, Vesper Quill was just another fixture, like the hand pump or the hitchin' rail. Useful, tough, and damn near invisible. That day the heat pressed down like a hot iron on the tin roofs, risin' in shimmery waves off the baked earth. Vespera stood at the window of her little clinic, grindin' dried sage in a mortar. The slow, steady scrape, scrape, scrape of the pestle was the only sound breaking the stillness. Outside, the wind was stirring, not the usual lazy puff. This was a low, sorrowful moan, like a fiddle played by a ghost, brushing the glass and carrying the sharp smell of dry lightning and parched ground. Vespera froze, hand hovering over the herbs. That old animal sense crawled up the back of her neck, the one that knows when the world's fixin' to turn upside down. She looked toward the horizon. Normally it was just a clean knife edge where red dirt met hard blue. Today the horizon had vanished. In its place rose a wall, tall, alive, the color of burnished copper and old gold, stretching from hell to high heaven. A dust storm. A big one. The town bell started clanging wild, frantic, like it was being swallowed by the wind. Men hollered in the street, yanking bandanas over their faces, rushing to shutter windows and chase livestock inside. Vespera moved quick and sure, the way habit teaches. She stowed her herbs, checked the latches, barred what needed barring. She wasn't scared. Fear needs something left to lose, and Vespera figured she'd already lost damn near everything worth a damn. She was just done. Then the wall of dust hit Solitude like a freight train, turning bright noon into a chokin' orange twilight. Through the roar she heard things that didn't fit. Not shutters banging, but rifle shots, sharp and mean. A horse screamed in terror. And then, high, trillin' war cries that turned her blood to ice. Vespera snatched her medical bag, instinct beating self-preservation every time, and cracked the front door. The world outside was pure orange chaos, grit swirling so thick she couldn't see 10 feet. But in that amber murk she caught shadows. They drifted like spirits, appearing out of the sand and melting back into it. These weren't the wild Comanche raiders the papers loved to scare folks with. These men wore ochre and charcoal paint across their faces, feathers dull in the stormlight. They moved silent and deadly through the madness of the town. Vesper knew she ought to slam that door, crawl under the bed, pray hard. But then she saw him. The town blacksmith, young Thorn Vale, staggering into the street, one hand clamped over his leg. Blood soaked dark and wet through his breeches. He pitched forward into the dirt, face first, hollering for help nobody else was going to give. Nobody but her. Without a second thought for her own hide, Vespera flung the door wide and ran straight into the storm. The wind hit like sandpaper, scour in her skin, burn in her eyes, fill in her mouth with the taste of old pennies. She reached Thorn, dropped to her knees in the muck. "Stay down!" she yelled over the howl. Her hands were already pressing hard on the wound. "I got you." She never saw the shadow rise behind her till it was too late. A hand, big, iron hard, clamped her shoulder. Vespera gasped, spun. A warrior stood there, face streaked in jagged white and black paint, club raised high. His eyes were wild, full of the raid's fire. He didn't see a woman. He saw something in the way. Vespera flinched, braced for the blow. She didn't scream. She just closed her eyes and thought, "So this is how it ends." But the club never fell. Instead, a voice rolled through the storm, deep, rough as broken rock, cutting clean through the howl. It barked one word in a tongue she didn't know, yet the meaning slammed home like a rifle shot. "Stop!" Vespera cracked her eyes open. The young warrior stood frozen, club still raised, but his fire had gone cold. He stared past her, shoulders dropping from killer to follower in a heartbeat. She turned, slow, following his line of sight. And that's when everything changed. Out of the churning orange haze rode a man on a huge black stallion, materializing like something the desert itself had coughed up. He was pure menace at first glance, broad as a barn door, bare-chested, every inch of him mapped with old scars and hard muscle. Silver threaded the temples of his long black braids, catching what little light pierced the dust. Older than the others, dangerous in a way that didn't need proving. But his eyes... Lord, those eyes stole the air right out of her lungs, not the flat black she'd braced for. Gray, wild, churning gray, like thunderheads right before they split open and pour hell. He sat his horse dead still while chaos spun around him, the eye of his own private storm. Calm, terrifying calm. His gaze flicked first to the young warrior, sharp enough to make the boy flinch, then dropped to Vespera. He took in her hands, still clamped hard on Thorn Vale's bleeding leg. He saw the medical kit dumped in the dirt, the dark stains spreading across her skirt. Most men looked right through her. Spinster. Widow. Part of the scenery. This one didn't. He studied her. Fierce, smart, unflinching, like she was the only thing in the whole damn storm worth seeing. Heat crawled up her skin that had nothing to do with the sun. He snapped a short order. The young warrior lowered the club, grabbed Vespera's arm in a bruising grip, and yanked her upright. "No," she cried, twisting against the hold. "He needs me! Let me finish!" The leader swung down from his horse in one fluid motion, boots hitting dust soft as a whisper despite his size. The raiders parted like water around him. He walked straight to her and stopped close. Too close. Up close he smelled of sage smoke, coming rain, and worn leather. His hand rose. Vespera braced for a blow. Instead, thick, calloused fingers caught the edge of her chin, tilting her face up. Not gentle, not cruel, just assessing. His thumb swept dust from her cheekbone in one slow stroke. An appraisal, cold and thorough. "He lives or dies on his own grit," the man said, voice gravel dragged over iron, English thick with an accent she couldn't pin down. "You come, now." Vespera's heart hammered like a cornered bird against her ribs. "I'm the healer here," she managed, voice shaking but steady underneath. "I can't just walk away." One corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile, something sharper, darker, like he'd heard that line before and already knew the ending. "Healer," he repeated, tasting the word. His eyes dropped to her blood-smeared hands again. "Then you're worth more than gold." He didn't ask permission, didn't wait. In one smooth, shocking lift, he scooped her by the waist, hoisting her clean off the ground. For a split second, the world spun. Then she was pressed against his chest, feeling the slow, heavy thud of his heart against her own racing one. Steady. Unbreakable. He swung her up onto the black horse, settling in behind her, his arm locked around her middle. Not tender, not possessive in the soft way. Iron. A cage of muscle and intent. Yes, it was a cage, but as the stallion wheeled and lunged into the blinding storm, carrying them away from solitude, Vespera felt a strange, dangerous spark catch in her chest. For 32 years, she'd been safe, proper, invisible. Now, pinned against this stranger's warmth, riding straight into wind and violence, she was terrified. Captive, in mortal danger, and, for the first time in her life, she wasn't unseen. But as the big black stallion wheeled and plunged deeper into the choking amber storm, carrying them away from solitude forever, a wild, terrifying thought clawed its way up Vespera's throat. For 32 long years, she'd played it safe, stayed proper, followed every rule the world laid down, and slowly withered in the quiet that came with it. Now she was crushed against the solid heat of this stranger, racing headlong into a land of raw wind and sudden death. Terror flooded her veins. She was a prisoner. She was in danger that could end her in a heartbeat. Yet as the last dusty outline of the trading post vanished behind them, swallowed by the storm, one truth burned brighter than the fear. She was no longer invisible. The warrior who held her, the one with thunder trapped in his gray eyes, had a name. Draven. It meant the bear in his tongue, and he was carrying her toward the high mesas, to a place no white man's map ever reached, where the real world began. The wind screamed around them, wild and furious, whipping dust into her face. But this time Vespera kept her eyes wide open. She watched the whole world bleed into streaks of gold and crimson, and for the first time in her life, she let herself wonder, who the hell would she become once the dust finally settled? The storm didn't rage forever. What came after felt heavier. A thick, pressing quiet that weighed more than the wind ever had. They rode for hours on end, leaving the flat, familiar scrub of the territory far behind. The life Vespera had known. General stores with their candy jars, church bells tolling on Sundays, wide wooden porches where folks sat and watched the world go by, faded into nothing. In its place rose a strange, otherworldly country, the Canyon Lands. Towering walls of blood-red stone climbed straight up to scrape the sky, a maze that could swallow a person whole. Out here the sun wasn't just bright. It was a hammer, pounding down on the rocks until they threw off waves of shimmering heat that made the air dance. Vespera sat behind Draven, every bone in her body screaming with exhaustion. She'd never ridden bareback like this, Hour after grinding hour, legs clamped tight to the horse's heaving sides, no saddle to ease the jolts. The physical ache was bad enough. But what really scared her was how close he was. She was molded against the broad back of a man who was supposed to be her enemy, feeling every shift of muscle as he guided the horse, the steady, powerful beat of his heart thudding against her ribs through the thin barrier of her dress. He smelled of wood smoke, honest sweat, and something sharp and clean like crushed pine needles. Whenever the trail narrowed along a sheer drop, or the horse stumbled on loose shale, his arm cinched tighter around her waist. Pure reflex, an iron band that kept her from tumbling into the void. It was confusing as hell, terrifyingly intimate. He was her captor, the man who'd stolen her freedom. Yet in this endless, indifferent wilderness, he was also the only thing standing between her and a long fall. Vesper kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting for whatever end was coming. She expected a killing ground, the kind the Eastern papers loved to paint in lurid ink. Savage brutality whispered about on trading post porches after dark. But no violence came. Just the endless ride and the deepening silence as twilight bruised the sky in deep purples and indigos. At last the group slowed. They dropped into a narrow arroyo, where a thin thread of clear water sliced through the stone. The air turned cooler here, carrying the scent of wet earth and sage. The men slid from their mounts with tired groans that sounded almost ordinary. Human. Draven swung down from the black stallion and lifted Vespera off in one easy motion. Her legs were jelly. They buckled the second her boots hit dirt. For a heartbeat, she collapsed against his chest. His big hands caught her arms, steady and sure, holding her upright just long enough to find her feet. Then he released her. He pointed to a flat boulder by the water's edge. "Sit," he said, voice low. Vespera obeyed. She watched him walk off to tend his horse, rubbing it down with slow, careful strokes. She sat alone, arms wrapped tight around herself. The leather thongs still bit into her raw wrists. Her throat felt like dry parchment. Fear crept back in, cold, sharp, familiar. She watched them build a fire, sparks snapping into the gathering dark. Shadows stretched long across the canyon floor. She braced herself for whatever came next. Then Draven returned. He towered over her, blotting out the first faint stars pricking the night sky. In his fist gleamed a knife, the blade snatching firelight, sharp as sin and twice as deadly. Vespera's breath locked in her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, twisted her face away, braced for the slice that would end it all. Cold steel kissed her skin. She flinched hard, but no pain followed. Only the sweet, sudden snap of relief as the leather thong parted and fell away from her wrists. Vespera's eyes flew open. She gasped, rubbing at the angry red welts on her pale skin, bewildered. Draven wasn't staring at her freed hands. He was already reaching into the pouch on his belt. Out came a strip of dark, cured venison, jerky, tough, and smoky. He didn't fling it at her feet like she was some stray cur. He snapped the piece in two with strong fingers and held out the bigger, thicker half. He dropped to a crouch so their eyes met level. For the first time, she noticed the deep lines of weariness carved around his mouth, the exhaustion he hid so well. "Eat," he rumbled, voice low and gravelly in his broad chest. "You need strength." Vespera's hand shook as she took the meat. "Why?" she whispered, throat raw and cracked. "Why set me loose?" He studied her a long beat, gray eyes catching the fire's glow like storm clouds lit from within. "A woman can't eat with paws bound like a snared wolf," he said simply, "and I don't let what's mine go hungry." Then he rose and walked back to the fire without another word, leaving her sitting there stunned. The jerky felt heavy in her palm. The whole world seemed to tilt just a fraction. I don't let what's mine go hungry. Possessive words, no doubt about it. Yet there was a hard, honest dignity in them, straightforward as a man who'd learned to survive on truth alone. Vespera tore into the tough meat, hunger roaring up fierce now that she let it. As she chewed, she really looked at the men circled around the flames. The nightmare shapes from the dust storm had vanished. In the warm firelight, war paint was streaked and smudged with sweat. These weren't the blood-crazed monsters the Eastern papers loved to paint. She saw a young buck chuckling low as he fumbled to mend a busted stirrup. She saw an older one kneeling by his horse, rubbing salve into a swollen leg, murmuring soft words like he was soothing a child. They were bone-tired. Clothes patched and threadbare, weapons old but meticulously cared for. Vespera, who'd spent a lifetime reading the quiet truths people hid in solitude, saw it clear as day. These weren't conquerors riding high. They were hunted men, fugitives holding on to the last scraps of a world hell-bent on wiping them out. They knew the tide was turning against them, and still they fought. Her eyes drifted back to Draven. He sat a little apart, back braced against a boulder. He wasn't eating, eyes closed, face pulled tight in a mask of pain. One big hand pressed to his side, fingers stained dark and wet. Vespera's chewing slowed. She squinted through the shifting shadows. Below his ribs, the leather tunic was soaked black. Fresh blood, seeping slow and steady. The healer in her woke before reason could argue. Same instinct that had sent her running into the storm for Thorn Vale. Healing wasn't just her job. It was the blood in her veins. Voices screamed inside her head. Stay put. Let him bleed out. If he weakens, you walk free. He's the enemy. But she watched how he sat, stoic, silent, refusing to let his men see the hurt. And something shifted. She stood. The motion was small, but it rippled through the camp like a stone dropped in still water. 2 young warriors sprang up, hands flashing to knife hilts. They barked something sharp in their language, stepping toward her fast. Vespera froze, heart slamming against her ribs. But she didn't back down. She locked eyes straight on Draven. He opened his eyes. Didn't move a muscle. His gaze pinned her where she stood, steady, unreadable, waiting. Slowly, deliberately, Vespera raised her empty hand, palm out, palm open, fingers spread wide to show she carried nothing. No knife, no threat. She pointed first to her own ribs, then straight to his side. You're bleeding, she said, voice clear and steady, cutting through the night wind like a bell. The words carried across the fire. One of the young warriors lunged forward, snatching her arm to drag her back to the rock. Stop! Draven's voice was quiet, barely more than a breath, but it cracked like a rifle shot in the still air. The young man froze mid-step, glancing back at his leader with wide eyes. Draven jerked his chin once. Let her through. The warrior scowled, teeth flashing in the firelight, but he released her arm and stepped aside. Vespera crossed the short stretch of ground between them. Her legs felt like lead, but her hands stayed rock steady. She dropped to her knees beside Draven. Up close, the coppery stink of fresh blood hit her hard. He watched her every move, body coiled tight, mountain lion ready to spring. May I? She asked softly, fingers hovering at the hem of his tunic. He didn't speak, just searched her face, looking for hate, for fear, for any sign of a lie. Finding none, he gave the slightest dip of his head. Vespera eased the leather aside. The wound was a nightmare. An old gash, badly stitched from some earlier fight, ripped open fresh during the raid. Angry red edges, swollen, weeping dark blood. "This has to be cleaned," she murmured, slipping into the calm, clipped tone she used on fevered children and broken ranch hands. It was armor, keeping the shake out of her soul. "Water? Whiskey?" she asked. Draven passed her a water skin without a word. She tipped a stream onto a torn scrap from her own petticoat, ripped the hem clean off without a second thought. Then she touched him. The instant her cool fingertips met the hot, fevered skin of his belly, the whole canyon seemed to hold its breath. The space between them vanished. Draven sucked in a sharp hiss. Muscles jumped under her hand like live wire. Vespera froze, eyes snapping up to his. They were inches apart. Close enough to count the golden flecks swimming in the storm gray. Close enough to see the pulse hammering in the hollow of his throat. For one long heartbeat, the world went silent. No wind moaning through the rocks, no fire snapping, just the charged hush of two souls from warring worlds finally touching across the divide of blood and history. He didn't look at her like a prisoner anymore. Not like loot, not like baggage. He looked at her with raw, burning curiosity, seeing the steady hands, the courage that had walked into a raid unarmed, the gentleness that refused to break. And Vespera, kneeling in the dirt with his blood on her fingers, felt a shock roll through her deeper than any fear the storm had brought. She was seen. "It'll sting," she whispered, voice trembling just a hair. "I've known worse pain," Draven answered, his low rumble vibrating right through her chest. "Do what you have to, healer." Vespera nodded and got to work. She flushed the wound clean, pressed hard to staunch the flow, then bound it tight with the makeshift cloth. All the while, Draven never once looked away from her face. When she tied the last knot and rocked back on her heels, wiping bloody hands on her skirt, she felt the shift like a fault line cracking open. The ropes were gone from her wrists, but something new had taken their place. An invisible line, strong as braided rawhide, binding them together. She was no longer just the woman he'd snatched from the storm, and he was no longer just the savage who'd stolen her. Under the cold, endless stars of the canyon country, something dangerous had kindled, a spark far deadlier than any desert furnace. If the Badlands were a roaring blaze, the hidden place Draven led her to was God's own quiet breath. Cool, still, sacred. They'd ridden through a hairline crack in the red rock, so tight the horse's sides scraped stone on both flanks. Vespera had squeezed her eyes shut, certain they were riding straight into a grave. But when the walls finally opened wide, she didn't find darkness. She found green. A secret box canyon tucked away from the world, guarded by cliffs so tall they brushed the clouds. But down in the heart of that hidden canyon, buried deep where the earth folded in on itself, lay something close to a miracle. A clear spring creek twisted right through the middle, gurgling soft and sweet over polished stones. Towering cottonwoods, old as time, trunks thick as wagons, stretched their branches overhead like the vaulted roof of some natural cathedral. Their leaves, gold-edged and green, rustled in the easy breeze that found its way down here. It was a secret Eden carved out of rock and stillness, a place the world outside had forgotten. Vespera had braced herself for chains, for a dirt-floor pen, for anything but kindness. When Draven eased her down from the black stallion in the middle of the village, he didn't haul her off to some guarded hut or tie her to a post. Instead, he walked her straight to a small lodge of stretched buffalo hide and cedar poles, set a little apart from the others, right beside the singing water. "You sleep here," he said, voice low and rough like distant thunder. "You're safe here." Then he turned and walked away. For the first week, Vespera lived in a state of tight-wired caution, every breath measured. She wasn't chained, but she couldn't leave. She wasn't welcomed like kin, yet she wasn't treated like chattel either. She drifted like a shadow on the edges of their days. Half ghost, half stranger. The women of the village watched her with hard, wary eyes. When she passed, they drew their shawls tighter, pulled their little ones close to their skirts. To them she was the pale face of the tide that kept rising, swallowing their land acre by acre. Vespera kept her gaze low. She swept the dirt floor of her lodge smooth. She knelt by the creek and scrubbed her dress until the calico wore thin, the soap suds swirling away downstream. She waited for the blow she was sure would come, the anger, the blame. But it never arrived. The fever did. It crept in on the shifting autumn wind, starting with the smallest ones, a sickness that turned tender skin hot and dry, eyes glassy as river stones. The village fell hushed. Children's laughter gave way to the medicine man's low, rhythmic chants and the soft, broken sobs of mothers. Vespera sat inside her lodge, ears tuned to the grief drifting through the walls. She knew those sounds too well, had heard them echo through solitude more times than she could count. One morning she saw Sabline, one of the women who'd stared hardest, suspicion sharp as a blade, stumble out of her own lodge. Exhaustion painted her face gray. In her arms she cradled a little girl, no more than 4 winters old. The child, Kestrel, hung limp as a rag doll. Her breaths came shallow, rattling like dry leaves in a tin cup. The medicine man had rattled his gourds, burned bundles of sage until the smoke hung thick. But the fever clung stubborn, and the little spirit was fading fast. Vespera didn't pause to think, didn't tally the danger. She simply snatched up the satchel Draven had carried out of the dust storm and crossed the clearing. When she reached Sabline, the woman hissed, clutching Kestrel tighter and stepping back. "Go," she spat in rough English. "White magic, bad." Vespera held her ground. She looked down at the child's flushed cheeks, then straight into the mother's frightened eyes. "It ain't magic," she said, voice steady as iron, stripping every trace of fear away. "It's willow bark to ease the hurt, cool water to fight the fire. Let me help her." Sabline wavered. She glanced at her dying girl, then back at the white woman standing there with empty hands and open heart. Desperation speaks louder than hate, in any tongue. Slowly, painfully, Sabline dipped her head once. For 3 days and 3 nights, Vespera never closed her eyes. She sat by the small fire in Sabline's lodge, sponging the child's burning skin with creek water. She brewed strong teas from willow and yarrow, coaxing bitter drops between Kestrel's cracked lips, one at a time. She hummed the wordless lullabies her own mother used to sing, soft, gentle tunes that floated up through the smoke hole into the night. Draven came once. He filled the doorway with his broad shoulders, blocking the starlight. He didn't speak, just watched her work, saw the dark circles under her eyes, the tenderness in every careful touch, the stubborn fight in her spine. He gave one slow nod, a quiet salute, then melted back into the darkness. On the 4th morning, the fever finally broke. Kestrel opened her eyes, clear, dark, and alive, and asked for water. Sabline broke then, tears streaming as she buried her face in Vespera's skirt, pressing frantic kisses to her hands, murmuring thanks in a voice thick with relief. The change hit the village like a thunderclap. Vespera was no longer the pale stranger, the outsider carrying the scent of the white world. She was the woman who'd stared death down and dragged a child back from the edge. That very evening, the women came to her lodge. No knock, no hesitation. They simply stepped inside. They carried steaming bowls of stew thick with venison chunks and wild onions, the savory steam curling up like an offering. They brought soft furs, warm against the evening chill. Then Sabline guided Vespera to sit on a thick buffalo robe spread before the fire. She moved behind her, gentle but sure, and began to unpin the severe bun that had held Vespera's plain brown hair for years, the tight, practical knot of a woman who'd long ago stopped hoping to be noticed. Sabline drew out the bone comb and worked slowly, rhythmically, loosening every strand. Then she braided it, long, dark ropes woven with thin strips of soft leather and tiny beads that caught the firelight. She styled it the way her own people did, proud, flowing, alive. It was more than a hairstyle. It was a welcome, a quiet claiming. Around the fire the women laughed softly, sharing bites of food and stories Vespera could only half follow, their voices weaving a warm net around her. For the first time in 32 years, something long frozen in her chest began to thaw. She felt the strange, sweet ache of belonging, of being part of a circle instead of standing forever outside it. The women had given her a place among them, but it was Draven who gave her purpose. His way of courting wasn't anything like the flowery tales she'd read in tattered books back east. No grand declarations, no picked bouquets of prairie roses. It was quiet, deliberate, the old way, slow burning and so intimate it stole her breath. He started leaving gifts without a word. One morning she stepped outside to find a fresh rabbit hanging by her door, skinned, cleaned, ready for the fire. A provider's quiet promise. Days later, on the flat rock where she washed at the creek, she found a comb of juniper wood, still carrying the sharp scent of pine. The handle was carved into a hawk in mid-soar, every feather etched with care. Not some store-bought trinket, hours of his hands shaping beauty just for her. Then, one evening, on her pillow, a simple river stone, black as midnight, smooth as glass from endless tumbling in the current. A thin vein of white quartz ran straight through the center, unbroken. Vespera cradled it in her palm, feeling its solid weight. She didn't need telling. He'd spotted it in the water, picked it up, seen something in it that reminded him of her. He never pushed, never stepped uninvited into her lodge, never tried to touch her. He simply stayed in her orbit, a steady, massive pull of gravity she found herself leaning toward without meaning to. One crisp autumn evening, the village had gone quiet. Vespera sat outside her lodge by a small fire, wrapped in the soft blanket Sabline had pressed into her hands. She heard the familiar crunch of boots on gravel and didn't startle. She knew that walk now. Draven stepped into the firelight. He didn't sit right away, just stood looking down at her, flames throwing deep shadows across the hard planes of his face. Tonight, the storm in his gray eyes had calmed to a gentle gray. "The child runs today," he said, voice a low rumble like far-off thunder. "She is strong." Vespera looked up at him. She just needed help finding her strength. He nodded once, then lowered himself to the ground. Not too close, but near enough that she felt the warmth rolling off him like heat from banked coals. They sat in silence for a long stretch. No awkwardness anymore. Just easy companionship, the kind that doesn't need words to fill it. Vespera turned the polished stone over in her hand, gathering courage for the question that had haunted her since the dust storm swallowed solitude. "Draven," she whispered. He turned his head slowly, eyes locking on hers. "Why?" she asked. "Why take me? Why save me? I was nothing to you, a stranger, an enemy." He stared into the fire a moment, picked up a dry twig, snapped it clean, and tossed the pieces into the flames. "I've seen many horses in my time," he said quietly. Some born wild. They run because running is all they know. But others? He paused, letting the words settle. Others are born in corrals, broken long before the saddle ever touches them. They stand in the dust, heads low, waiting for the whip. He turned back to her, gaze stripping away every defense she had left. When I saw you in that storm, I saw a woman standing in a corral, but your eyes, they were searching for the gate. Vespera's breath caught sharp in her throat. I didn't save you, Vespera, he said, speaking her name for the first time, rough on his tongue, yet reverent like a prayer. I saw a spirit already strong. I just carried it to a place where it could finally breathe. She stared at him, tears stinging hot behind her eyes. In solitude, her husband Gideon had seen a housekeeper. The town had seen a midwife. Draven looked at her and saw her, truly saw her. She glanced around the darkening canyon, at the lodge that had become hers, at the stone warm in her hand. And with a jolt that terrified her, she realized she didn't miss solitude. Didn't miss the ticking clock or the empty clinic. She'd been lonely in a town full of people. But here, in the heart of the wild, sitting beside a man who'd barely laid a hand on her, she felt precious. She looked at Draven. For the first time, she didn't see a captor. She saw the only man who'd ever bothered to truly find her. I'm breathing, she whispered, soft as a secret. For the first time, I'm breathing. Draven didn't smile, but his eyes softened, storm clouds parting after rain. He reached out, hand hovering a heartbeat before he covered hers, enfolding her small fingers and the stone in the warmth of his palm. Then breathe, he said. He said, and in the sheltered heart of that stone canyon, beneath the quiet watch of the ancient cottonwoods, the slow ember between their hearts finally burst into flame. Peace, Vespera had come to learn, is a fragile thing, thin as a soap bubble drifting over a bed of cactus spines, lovely, shimmering, but one wrong gust and it pops forever. For weeks the canyon had been its own hidden universe, the wars raging beyond the cliffs, the shifting borders on paper, the furious men in Washington arguing over land they'd never walked. It all felt like a fever dream from another lifetime. Vespera had slipped into the steady pulse of sunup and sundown. She'd forgotten maps existed, forgotten men drew lines in ink and spilled blood to defend them. But the outside world has a way of sniffing out secrets that want to stay buried. It happened on what she figured was a Tuesday. The air carried a sharp bite, the clean smell of leaves turning gold and red. She was down near the narrow mouth of the canyon, where the creek squeezed tight between sheer red walls. She was gathering willow switches, basket resting on the sandy bank, humming a half-remembered tune, part old hymn, part the soft lullaby she'd heard the women sing to Kestrel. Then the quiet shattered. Not wind. Iron clanging on stone, heavy, careless thud of shod hooves, rough voices barking loud in English. Vespera froze. The willow branch snapped in her fist. She backed into the shadow of the canyon wall, heart pounding so hard it bruised her ribs. Through the tight gap in the rocks, 3 riders pushed into view. Not soldiers, no crisp uniforms, no disciplined lines. These were worse. Prospectors, greasy coats stiff with tallow, beards matted, eyes burning with that wild, mountain-eating greed. Pack mules trailed behind, loaded down with picks, shovels, and the stink of ambition. They were men who looked at the earth and saw only what they could tear out of it. Invaders in worn boots. Vespera pressed flat against the cold stone, holding her breath. Go on, she prayed silently. Just ride past. But the lead rider, a pockmarked, sun-scorched face under a battered hat, yanked his mule to a halt. He sniffed the air like a hound, eyes narrowing on the clear water spilling from the canyon. Water that shouldn't be running this strong in the dry season. "Well now," he rasped, spitting a thick wad of tobacco into the pure stream. "Look at that. Water means green. Green means a camp. Could be hostiles, boys." The second man muttered low, hand drifting to the rifle butt in his scabbard. "Or could be gold." The leader grinned, yellow teeth flashing. "Let's take a look." They spurred forward, heading straight for her. Vespera stepped back, her boot crunched dry gravel, loud as a pistol shot in the narrow silence. The lead rider's head whipped around. His eyes widened. For a long second he just stared, trying to make sense of it. A white woman in soft deerskin dress, standing bold in a place no white woman should be. "My God," he breathed. "It's a white woman. Hey! Hey, miss!" The shout bounced off the canyon walls. Vespera stood rooted, clutching the willow branches like a shield. "Don't you worry, girl," he called, swinging down from the saddle and starting toward her, arms spread wide in what he probably thought was a comforting gesture. It looked predatory as a hawk's dive. "We got you. You're safe now. We'll get you out of this hellhole." The word twisted in the air, hellhole, like he was rescuing her from monsters instead of walking into her home. He saw a victim, a damsel in need of saving. A tall tale he could spin in Tucson saloons for free whiskey and backslaps. He saw a woman who needed deliverance from savages. Vespera looked at his face. Rough, greedy, entitled. She caught the sour reek of whiskey on his sweat even from 10 feet away. Then she looked past him. High on the ridge above, silhouetted sharp against the blinding blue sky, stood a shadow. Motionless. Bow in hand. Arrow already nocked. High on the ridge, etched sharp against the blinding blue, stood a shadow. Still as carved stone. Draven. Bow gripped steady, arrow already nocked. In the last 10 heartbeats he could have dropped the lead prospector a dozen different ways, before the man's boot even kissed the sand. But he hadn't loosed. His gaze was locked on her. Bow dipped just a fraction. Not aimed at the intruder. Waiting. He was giving her the choice, a silent, gut-twisting test hanging between the cliff face and the river. Do you want to go back? Here's your old world. Here are your people. They've come to drag you home. Vespera swung her eyes back to the prospector. Come on, darlin', he wheedled, stepping closer, boots smashing the wildflowers she'd gathered that morning into the dirt. Run to me. We'll kill the rest of them, burn this place to ash and take you home where you belong. Home. The word landed like a slap. She thought of solitude, the hollow silence of her empty cabin, the way she'd moved through days like a ghost no one bothered to see. Useful, sure. Cherished? Never. Then she thought of the smooth river stone tucked in her pocket, of Kestrel's fever breaking under her hands, of the way Draven looked at her across the fire, like she was the sun, the moon, and every star between. She looked at the prospector again. Rough, greedy, smelling of whiskey and entitlement. And she didn't see a rescuer. She saw a thief. The fear in her chest burned away, replaced by something colder, sharper, a mother bear fury rising for the only family she'd ever truly had. Vespera let the willow branches fall from her fingers. She stepped out of the shadows, spine straight, chin high. Stop! She screamed. The prospector froze, blinked hard. Miss, get out. Her voice ripped raw and thunderous, echoing off the narrow walls like a cannon shot. There's nothing here for you. Leave! Confusion flashed across his face, then fury twisted it ugly. "Now listen here," he snarled. "You've been brainwashed. We ain't leaving you with these. I am where I belong," she shrieked. She didn't just stand there. She lunged, snatched a heavy river rock from the bank, and hurled it with every ounce of strength she had, not at the man, but at the pack mule behind him. The stone slammed into the animal's flank. The mule screamed, reared, twisting its lead rope in panic. The other horses spooked, bucking and thrashing in the tight entrance. Dust exploded. Men cursed, yanking reins, fighting to keep their seats. "She's crazy!" one rider yelled. "She's gone native! Jeb, let's go!" "No!" the leader, Crux Wilder, snarled, face purpling with rage. The savior mask shattered, revealing the violence underneath. "I ain't leaving empty-handed. If she won't come willing, we take her." He yanked the revolver from his belt, leveled it straight at Vespera. A roar rolled down from the cliffs above, like a whole mountainside giving way. Draven didn't fire from cover. He launched himself down the scree slope in a blur of fury and muscle, boots skidding, rocks flying. He hit the canyon floor running and planted himself square between the gun barrel and Vespera. Crux pulled the trigger. Crack! The sound split the air like lightning. Vespera screamed. She saw Draven jerk, violent, unnatural, strings cut on a puppet. A fine red mist hung in the sunlight for a heartbeat. He didn't fall. Not yet. He stood like a granite wall, feet rooted in the sand. With a guttural roar of pure defiance, he drew his bow in one seamless motion and loosed. The arrow hissed, buried deep in Crux's shoulder, pinning him to his own saddle like a butterfly on a board. The man shrieked, revolver clattering to the dirt. "Run!" he howled at his companions. "Run, damn you!" The wounded man howled at his partners, voice cracking with pain and panic. The sight of the towering warrior, bleeding from the chest but still standing tall, unbowed, was more than their nerve could take. The prospectors yanked their horses around, scrambling back through the narrow gap in the rocks. Their bravery shattered like dry glass under the raw fury of the defense. They vanished in a cloud of dust. The grit began to settle slow and quiet. Vespera didn't watch them flee. She was already running. "Draven!" He turned toward her. The storm that usually raged in his gray eyes had faded to something hazy, distant, like smoke after a fire. He tried to shape a smile, tried to rasp out that she'd been brave. "You stayed," he managed, voice thin and wet. Then his knees buckled. Vespera caught him as he fell, but his weight pulled them both down hard into the sand. She dragged his head into her lap, hands flying over his chest in desperate search. The bullet had punched high on his right side. Dark blood welled fast, pulsing hot between her fingers. Terrifying, unstoppable. "No! No! No!" she wept, pressing down with every ounce of strength she had. Her healer's mind clashed with the raw agony tearing through her heart. "Don't leave me," she begged, voice breaking. "Don't you dare leave me, Draven." He lifted a trembling hand, heavy as lead, and brushed her cheek. His own blood smeared across her pale skin, a streak like war paint, like a solemn vow. "You chose," he whispered, words bubbling wet. "My Vespera." His hand slipped away, his eyes fluttered shut. In the canyon that had been paradise just moments before, Vespera threw her head back and let out a scream of pure grief that rattled the cottonwood leaves overhead. It wasn't the cry of a captive. It was the cry of a wife watching her whole world bleed into the sand. She had passed the test. She had chosen her home. But the cost lay dying in her arms. The gunshot that echoed off the canyon walls didn't signal the end. It marked the start of the longest night of Vesper Quill's life. The hidden beauty of the box canyon was shattered. The secret was out. Even if those prospectors never came back, others would. The map had been drawn in blood now, and safety had become nothing more than a memory. Vespera knew they had to move. Fast. But Draven could barely stand. The bullet had punched clean through, missing the lung but stealing his strength in rivers of red. The other warriors argued for a hard ride toward the border, pushing the horses to their limit. Vespera shut that down cold. "If he rides," she told them, voice shaking with a fierce edge that silenced the whole council, "he bleeds out, and if he bleeds out, he dies. We go up, we go deep, and we go slow." They rigged a travois from cedar poles and stretched buffalo hide. They carried him like shadows, slipping up the treacherous switchbacks of the canyon wall. Vespera walked beside him every step, wiping cold sweat from his brow, whispering words that were half prayer, half command. "Stay with me. Fight." When they finally reached a high, hidden cave, far above the reach of greedy eyes, the true battle began. For 3 long days the fever burned hot. Draven thrashed in delirium, skin scorching, calling out names of the dead in a voice that broke her heart. Vespera never left his side. She was no longer a trembling captive tending a stranger. She was a woman fighting for the other half of her soul. She dug deep into every scrap of knowledge she owned. Poultices of yarrow and spider webs to staunch the bleeding. Cool water trickled between his cracked lips, her small hands pinning his thrashing body to the earth when nightmares took hold. She slept, sitting up, one hand resting over his heart, terrified that if she closed her eyes even for a second, the steady beat would stop. On the 4th morning, the fever finally broke. Sunlight filtered pale and golden into the cave. Vespera was dozing, head pillowed on her knees. She felt the air shift, a change in the rhythm of the space around her. She lifted her head. Draven was watching her. His eyes, once stormy gray, were clear now, though the light in them had dimmed to a faint, steady glow. "Vespera," he rasped. It was barely a breath, but to her it rang like a full choir breaking into song. She scrambled to his side, tears already spilling hot down her cheeks. "I'm here," she choked out. "You're safe. You're alive." He tried to push himself up, but pain lanced through him and he groaned deep and raw. His shaking hand reached for hers. Instead of drawing her close, though, he gently pressed her palm away. "You have to go," he said, voice thick with sorrow. "The secret's out. Soldiers will come. More prospectors will come. I can't keep you safe here anymore." He looked at her with heartbreaking nobility, trying to do the honorable thing, trying to open the cage door before the whole thing went up in flames. "Go back to solitude," he whispered. "Go back to safety. You're free, Vespera." She stared at him, at the jagged scars crisscrossing his chest, at the man who'd thrown himself between her and a bullet without a second's hesitation. She thought of the hollow emptiness of her old life, the kind of safety that felt like lying down in a pine box and pulling the lid shut. She didn't speak, didn't argue. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned down. Her hands framed either side of his face, feeling the rough scratch of his beard, the fever warmth of his skin. And she kissed him. Not a quick brush. This was a kiss that carried months of silence, months of aching want, months of fear held back. It tasted of sage smoke and hard-won survival. Soft at first, like a question hanging in the air. Then it deepened into an answer, fierce and final, a dam breaking after too long holding back the flood. When she finally drew back, Draven looked stunned, eyes wide, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "You're a fool," he murmured, though his hand rose to cradle the back of her head, refusing to let her pull away. "No," Vespera whispered, resting her forehead against his. "I'm certain." "There's no safety with me," he warned, voice rough. "Only wind and mountains." "I don't want safety," she said, voice trembling with the weight of her truth. "I want you. My home isn't some town, Draven. My home is wherever your heart beats, and I'm not going anywhere." He searched her face for a long, endless moment, looking for doubt, for regret, finding none. Then a smile broke across his face, rare and beautiful as the first light after a long winter storm. He pulled her down against his chest, right over the bandage, right over the steady thump of his life. "Then stay," he breathed into her hair. "Stay, and be my heart." The seasons rolled on, the way they always do. Summer's red dust gave way to autumn's gold, then to winter's hushed white silence. High in the mountains, far past where any map bothered to go, stood a small cabin of rough-hewn logs, chinked tight with river clay. Smoke drifted lazy from the chimney, curling up into the sharp, cold air. Inside, the fire snapped and popped, throwing warm, dancing light across the walls. The wind howled outside like a beast scratching at the door, but the latch held firm, and the little family was safe. Vespera sat in a rocking chair he'd carved from pine, older now, face weathered by sun and wind, fine laugh lines fanning from the corners of her eyes. She hummed a quiet tune that wove together two worlds, an old hymn carried on the steady beat of a drum. In her arms, wrapped snug in the soft, thick fur of a winter wolf pelt, lay a sleeping child, small but sturdy. He had his mother's nose, but his hair was thick and dark as a raven's wing. He slept with one tiny fist curled tight, already dreaming like a fighter. A warrior already in his dreams. The door creaked open, letting in a quick swirl of snow that danced across the floorboards. Draven stepped inside, stomping the white powder from his boots with heavy, deliberate thuds. He carried a fresh armload of split firewood, the scent of pine clinging to him like mountain air. He looked older now, 2 winters deeper into the silver that had started at his temples, and now threaded wider through his dark hair. His walk carried a slight hitch, a permanent echo of the bullet that had almost stolen him away. But his eyes still burned bright, sharp as ever. He set the wood by the hearth with a soft clunk, crossed the room in long strides, and knelt beside the rocking chair. One big, calloused finger reached out, tracing the baby's soft cheek with surprising gentleness. The child, Aslan, stirred, sighing in his sleep, small fist flexing once before settling again. Draven looked up at Vespera. The storm that had once lived in his gray eyes was gone. In its place was only deep, quiet peace. "He grows like the pine," he whispered, voice low and rough with pride. "Strong, straight, like his father." Vespera smiled, leaning down to press a soft kiss to his forehead, lingering there a heartbeat longer. Outside, the world kept turning, changing in ways neither of them could stop. The railroad was snaking closer, iron tracks cutting through the open land. Fences were rising, barbed wire stitching the wild into neat, owned squares. The free-roaming era was fading, closing like an old book read by firelight. Down in the towns, folks still spun tales about the healer from Solitude. They said she'd been snatched by savages, said she'd vanished into the wild, a tragic victim swallowed by a merciless land. They shook their heads, pitied the poor woman who'd disappeared in that dust storm. But they were wrong. Vespera looked at her husband, scarred, steady, the only man who'd ever truly seen her. She looked at her son, small and fierce even in sleep. She looked at the life they'd clawed out of impossible stone, built with calloused hands and stubborn love. She wasn't lost. She was the only one who'd ever truly found her way. As the scene fades, pulling back from the warm glow of the cabin window, We drift over the vast, raw, heart-breakingly beautiful landscape. The mountains stand silent guard over the high mesa, keeping their secrets close. And if you listen close to the wind whispering through the pines, you won't hear the lonely fiddle anymore. You'll hear a song of freedom. And that, friends, is the story of Vespera and Draven. A tale of finding love in the last place anyone would look, and having the raw courage to claim it, even when the whole damn world says you're crazy for trying. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso legal / disclaimer. Our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully, only to support production, while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.